is today's the last meeting that we've got with the department, at least on the schedule. Just a quick review of our task again, which is that the Department of Education is to submit a report. They have to have a process, a timeline, and a plan established. Our job is to assist them with that plan and go over things to a degree of specificity, and consult whether or not the appropriate provision of services for children 3 years of age is through a quasi-independent agency, or how that should work. And lastly, we have the right to provide advice, and also we can talk to the legislative committee. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to briefly introduce ourselves again to each other. We really haven't had an opportunity. This really is our committee who's here. It looks like we're getting more people, which is fantastic. This is our opportunity to talk. We're going to have a review and discussion and reaction to what we got from the Department of Education. Oh, what am I talking about? We've got more. We've got one. Roberta's here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us. 8 of us. 8 of us here. That's on the committee, which is still.
I'm not on this committee, Nancy. I'm on 255.
Roberta, you're not? You're
no,
on
I'm
255.
On 255.
Who from the department is on this particular committee? Nobody. All right. Well, we've got 7 of us here. Okay.
Can I just interrupt? Megan Barnes, if you can hear me, if you could let us know if you're having trouble becoming a panelist, that would be fantastic. Maybe she got on now.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
okay.
Here she comes.
All right. Excellent. All right. So we've got 8. So what we're going to do just very, very briefly is we're going to review the department, what they have sent us. Hey, Megan, how are you? We're going to introduce ourselves quickly. We're going to talk about key and critical discussion topics. We're going to talk about next steps and then planning for the Education Committee. Hopefully you got my agenda that I sent out earlier today. So very quickly, let's go around and introduce ourselves. I'm Nancy Cronin. I am the Executive Director of the Maine Developmental Disabilities Council. I'm your chair. I'm psyched to be here. More people are coming in. I'm even happier. Erin, will you introduce yourself, and then Carol, and I'll just call.
Sure. I'm Erin Fraser. I'm the Director of Special Services, birth to 22 at the Department of Education.
Great.
Carol Martin, and I'm here to support your discussion.
Roberta, and then JC. I'm just going to go by the order.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, sorry. I'm Dr. Roberta Lucas. I'm the CDS State Director, birth to 5.
And I'm JC Holmes. I'm the Federal State Legislative Liaison for the Department of Education.
I jumped the gun a little bit. I am a co-chair. I am not the major chair. So I am a co-chair. And may I introduce my other co-chair?
Hi, I'm Tiffany Haskell. I'm a Special Ed Director and a Clinical Director at WABAN, and I'm here on behalf of Maxby, which is a community service provider in Maine organization.
Jillian, and then Carrie.
Hi, I'm Jillian O'Brien. I am a private practice pediatric. I own a pediatric clinic, and I am representing MEODA.
Hi, I'm Carrie Woodcock. I'm the Executive Director for Maine Parent Federation.
Megan, and then Heather.
I'm Megan Barnes. I'm a Head Start Director for Aroostook County Action Program.
Heather.
That's me. All right, Heather Martin. I'm the Policy Director for the Maine Association for the Education of Young Children.
Awesome. Megan Welter, and then Jamie McLeod.
Hello, my name is Megan Welter. I am recently appointed Director of Government and Policy Affairs for the Department of Ed.
I am Jamie McLeod. I'm a parent. I've got an almost 4-year-old little girl, Lydia, who receives services from CDS.
And Rita, and then Priscilla.
Hi, Rita Furlow, Senior Policy Analyst at the Maine Children's Alliance. And yeah, I too been a parent who whose child went through the CDS system, but but he's now 21, so it's been a while.
Hi, I'm Priscilla Congdon, Special Ed Coordinator at Coastal Kids Preschool in Damascotta, here as a childcare provider for NACE.
Great. And I'm happy to say I do think we have a quorum now, so that's fantastic. For the first part of our conversation, we're going to have a brief introduction. You've all got the timeline, a brief introduction of the timeline and looking at the protocol of the timeline and the conceptual framework. I'm going to turn this over to JC and Megan. I'll continue facilitating. The goal really is to get our feedback and discussion about this topic. So take
Nancy,
it away.
just to clarify rules, do you want me in a listening capacity? That's what I think I'm hearing you say.
I think so. What I'd like you to if you would make sure that everybody who wants to speak is getting to speak, that would be amazing. So yes, please.
All right, so I'll jump in, and JC, you'll jump in with me. Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Welter, and I worked closely with JC Holmes to try to take the feedback from this committee, also the review of the resolves, to make sure that we were capturing as much as we could, turning it into the timeline. As you may recall, part of what we discussed, I think it was in the January 24th and 25th meetings. Actually, it came out much more so in the 255 group, was really focusing on making sure that we came up with a conceptual framework that we would really deliver to the Educational Cultural Affairs Committee. And we also got some guidance around the timeline. But one of the things that we want to acknowledge is one of the challenges of putting a timeline like this together is we needed to capture not only how interrelated everything is and how subject to really careful sequencing the enactment of all three of these LDs would be, but it's also really complex, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. And so we really were walking that line of trying to figure out how are we appropriately descriptive, and at the same time also sort of reflecting that, like, if we tried to put a row in for every step, it would have been days of scrolling. And just a lot of information. And so we wanted it to be manageable and at the same time, really accessible. So JC and I are going to tell you a little bit about sort of our assumptions or some of our thinking that helped, or our process that helped to sort of frame this work. First, what we were doing is we started with the feedback that we got. Whereas I was just starting with the department mid-January, I went back and watched and read, watched your former meetings and read the feedback that was captured in the PowerPoints. JC also was taking notes and involved in those meetings. And what we did is we tried to capture all the information from the different advisory committees, 386 and 255, and incorporate that feedback and some of those decisions and some of that processing into the timeline. And then from there, JC worked really carefully to go through the timeline and pull out the pieces that would sort of create the statutory framework that we hope to, or the conceptual framework. But one of the things that we can see now as we sort of take a step back and then take a step forward and take a step back again, is that there were some places where our assumptions that sort of helped guide our work were not necessarily apparent to people who were not in our heads or present for the discussions as we were working together to craft these timelines. So for instance, one of the things that I know we talked about, and JC, you can jump in if I'm missing anything, was just sort of like, what were we thinking as we were looking at the steps for talking about billing under under LD 135. And sort of what we've been looking at is, okay, well, certainly it's not our decision to make, but as we're looking at all of the different pieces, it seems like we're probably going to be moving toward a third-party billing. And so if that were the case, what are the steps we'd need to go through to be able to get to that? So that's an example of, like, we didn't say there's a decision point in here. We just built the steps based on that kind of thinking and the feedback that we've been hearing from these groups. JC, what do you think?
I think one of the other things that I remember some people asking questions about, and you have to understand that I think Megan and I, when we first spent a Saturday, it was about 6 hours of trying to look at all of your notes and feedback on the PowerPoints to try and make sure that as much of what we had recorded could be placed in there. I think another assumption that we made around the hybrid model for like the 4-year-olds was that there would be some sort of an assessment of readiness. We have 36 existing SAUs that have contracts with the department, and we thought that might be a good place to start in terms of looking at what are the deliverables within those contracts. There also, our public 4-year-old staff have what's called a public preschool toolbox. So we're thinking that what we might eventually do is sort of take what are those elements of those contracts of the 36 SAUs and blend that or add to it the public preschool toolbox to look at what is the readiness of the SAUs, and then also to begin looking at over time. We know we have 36 right now. There's another, I think, 10 or so that have been in touch with Roberta, and then to begin to look at, well, what's the natural next block in order to get us to the sort of net result at the end of like 2024, so that there's a natural rollout and increase in that regard. Part of, I think, looking at that assessment readiness is what in the public, and it's in the preschool toolbox, is sort of what's the spacing situations, what's the curriculum and assessment and data kinds of considerations that are already part of those public programs. So there are documents that exist out there that can serve as resources in this process. I think the other concept with the hybrid that I remember having discussions was that it will shift from the CDS sites to the public schools so that the SAU will provide some oversight. But I remember distinctly some discussions about maintenance of contracts with existing providers so that there is not a transition for families, but really a taking on of those contracts, but the oversight by the SAU for making sure that services are getting to the children as they are supposed to. I think
Erin, did you want in? I'm sorry, JC, to interrupt.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, I think the shift that you're referring to, JC, is the shift of the FAPE obligation.
Yeah.
So that's going to be really important for people to understand that in the hybrid model, the SAUs and CDS all have shared responsibility in the provision of service. But at this point, the FAPE offer is on CDS. So I just want to clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece that I would just chime in on, and JC certainly can speak to this more, is as we began preparing to put the timeline together, we realized that the IEU was a piece that we learned had been put in place in 1991. And then during the reauthorization in 1997 was no longer allowed except for those states where it was already in use. And so in order for us to make this transition as smoothly as possible, we have to maintain the IEU and use that structure. And so that was another piece that informed a lot of our planning was, okay, we have to maintain the IEU as we're putting the new structures into place.
And that means to a large extent that the IEU maintains itself. Primarily, it will probably, as the transition of the 3s, 4s, and not yet school age 5s are going to the SAUs, we won't pull the state IEU apart to only be responsible for Part C until we've reached the nexus of all of the 3s, 4s, and school age, not school age 5s are part of the SAU. So that's why you see in the timeline, the blue line for the SAU continues to the same end goal as the SAU. I think the other addition that I might add was that there was a question that Nancy raised as we were chatting with her over the last Friday, was how are we going to ensure that there's SAU oversight during the hybrid period? And certainly there is existing staff that review the public preschool programs on a regular cycle basis, just as there is monitoring and oversight by special education of the implementation of early childhood special education. So we will continue to maintain our oversight for looking at compliance in both regards. I think another piece is that the Chapter 101 rule will be undergoing a rulemaking process probably in the next year or so to basically separate the Part C out of Chapter 101. So it is its own freestanding rule. And then 101 will be refined to reflect Part B 3 to 22, which we need to expand it to that newer time frame. The bulk of the sections of those of that regulation, however, will still maintain all of its federal obligations. And I'm not sure whether we'll maintain the font situation that we've had to distinguish what's the federal requirement as differentiated from state policy. But that rulemaking will be something that is on a rulemaking agenda for sometime in the next year to 18 months.
The last piece I'll jump in on, and then I know, Nancy, I want to let you speak. I've seen you unmute just a minute or two. Is that the timeline is kind of a living document. And as we learn more from different teams that we're meeting with, for instance, as we meet with the finance team, we need to keep taking in and having that feedback reflected in the timeline. And similarly, just even, you know, as we are trying to learn from you all, and as you are providing feedback for us, it may inform an additional row or two. Again, what we were really trying to do with the timeline itself was to articulate the steps to show how interrelated those steps are, and make sure that people kind of had a sense of the sequencing. But it certainly is not intended to be an exhaustive or entirely comprehensive document, because we just didn't think that that would be accessible.
We also were talking about the fact that there will be some things that get explored and sort of reviewed in depth. For example, like what is the capacity of the SAUs and how far along are they getting? But we couldn't figure out a way of grading the colors, or as more and more SAUs came on board and more of them took on the responsibility. So just look at the fact that there is right now a single color is really not indicative of the growth and change over time. Because literally in the last 2.5 weeks, we've probably added 10 or 15 lines to the document as we've had further discussions with finance in particular as to what kinds of things need to be reviewed. And the other assumption I think we ought to add is that the discussions with our school finance team is that there will be a separate funding stream from the EPS. We've certainly heard that from superintendents and others. So we're going to have to review how that funding stream works, as well as how it works in concert with the establishment of public 4-year-old programs that eventually get supported by school subsidy. And some of the new ones right now are being supported by COVID funding, as well as some of the programs that currently Division or Office of Special Ed is moving together. So there, in that case, there's 3 different ways that we're examining the public early childhood educational programs that also needs to be part of the mix.
I think, and I'm looking at we have a extremely tight timeline with a tremendous amount that we need to talk about. And I think I want to open it 2 ways. One, and Tiffany, if this is okay. First, I want to ask are there questions from what you just heard? And then let's go through let's go to the timeline and have you do some responses there that you've been asked to do. So are there, or are there things not in the timeline? So let's do, are there questions? Are there things not in the timeline that concerns you? And what kind, and then let's start having some critical conversations. So the first is, are there questions about what you just heard? I have one, but I'm going to let other people speak first because I will talk forever. I'm interested in hearing more about the 3-year-olds. It sounds like the 3-year-olds are kind of set in a plan somewhere. Oh, good. Carrie, go ahead.
I just want to clarify that I'm hearing this correctly. JC, you said that you are part of the rulemaking process for the changes for the Maine Unified Special Ed regulations is going to be to pull birth to 3 out and make it its own set of regulations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what's being contemplated, to make it clear that Part C is different from Part B.
Okay, so there'll be 2 sets of special education regulations then.
That is correct.
Okay, I just wanted to.
And one will be from 0 to 2, and the other will be 3 to 22.
Correct.
So my follow-up question, if we apply to OSEP, which I think we are doing, to have parents have the option to stay in Part C when their child turns 3, the regulations that will apply to them is going to be birth to 2, even though their child's 3.
We will probably have to, once we receive approval from OSEP for the Part C extension, then we would probably include that as a new section of the Part C regulations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Aaron?
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure people understood that in the Part C extended option, the child stays on an IFSP, but there is an added element of pre-academic skills that is added to that plan.
Okay. All right, let's start moving through the protocol. Is there anything not in the timeline that you wanted to make sure that you got to speak about? There's lots in there, but is there anything specific? We were talking about the protocol.
Heather?
Yeah, and let me know if I'm getting ahead and getting too specific on the timeline. So I'm looking under LD 386, and I see considerations for how early childhood learning staff will continue to partner with 4-year-old public preschool programs. So is that the early childhood learning, like the DOE staff?
I think part of it is going to actually, Roberta has already done a survey of existing staff and wants to do a deeper examination, because part of what we want to look at is what are the backgrounds of the existing CDS staff who want to perhaps be transitioning to the SAUs. And there is going to be some very focused course offerings for people that are at different tiers and needing different kinds of courses in order to increase their credentialing. We certainly want to move as many as possible as in as timely manner as possible to the 282 credentials, so that they might, work with under a existing special ed director. So we're looking at who might be, by virtue of their education and background, in a position for taking on some additional coursework to be credentialed over the next several years.
Okay, so those are the actual staff working for CDS now then?
Yes, that
Okay.
was our conceptual framework as we looked at it, yes.
Okay, no, thank you for that clarification. So I guess the piece I feel like might be missing here is how we're working with SAUs on taking that oversight of special education programming that goes beyond their public preschool programming. So in the private childcare programs.
So I think a piece of that would be looking at what are the existing contracts that are in place with some of the SAUs, but also what existing contracts does CDS have for programs that are in that geographic or SAU region, so that we look at how that might continue in the mix for that SAU, if that's how they see themselves moving forward.
Okay, I think for me, because, you know, right now CDS doesn't contract with every childcare program. They just bring the childcare services in as the least restrictive environment. So I guess it's the least restrictive environment language I'm missing here, and how SAUs are going to be able to come into that system and pick up those services that are kind of happening already out in the community, but not within the public school. So for example, Megan, if I can use you as an example, you are a childcare program and CDS delivers services within our program, but there may not be a contract there per se. You're just the least restrictive environment for that child. So just potentially some language in here about how we're going to be able to help educate SAUs and support those transitions, that they can partner with childcare programs and other community programs.
Let's move us now. It's 1:28. The committee has not had much opportunity to just share concerns. And I think concerns and conversations. Let's move us there a little. We can continue. I just don't want to lose the committee having a chance to have their voice. Tiffany, I see you.
Sure. You know, I guess, you know, I definitely appreciate that the timeline is the working document, and I think that that's reasonable and, you know, makes a lot of sense. Especially as you begin to look at how they really do all intertwine with one another. But just specifically relative to 386, because that's just the hat that I've tried to wear this whole time. You know, I kind of go back to, I think basically what was the very first thing that I ever said in any of these meetings. And that is that it was always my false impression, I guess now, but my understanding going in that what we would basically be doing is working with the department on the implementation plan to move 4-year-olds to public schools. And certainly it seems now that, you know, that's 3 and 4-year-olds, but to me, I see the timeline as one of those pieces. Just like in the opening of the resolve, what the department, what the legislature has requested, seemed to me, was a timeline, an implementation plan, a report February 1st with specificity, for example, around a funding plan. And I'm not sure if those are separate pieces that are going to be presented to the legislature. But to date, we haven't seen those other pieces, right? Just the timeline, which has definitely gotten more complex and robust. But some of the things, for example, that in the absence of an implementation plan and a report, if we're only looking at a timeline, I really did put a lot of weight on the whole idea of a funding plan, of you know, SAU readiness. And for example, those two pieces, and I hear you saying that you know, added more around the funding piece, but to me, the timeline is one piece, the implementation plan is another piece, and the report probably includes both of those. But I don't know where we're at in the bigger picture with some of those other items.
I think I'd like some guidance from the team. I'm really interested in collecting feedback. I mean, we can start to weigh in on our responses to each question, but then I'm concerned then we won't get through feedback. So just, what do you think?
I think that's fine. I think moving a little bit to a critical conversation on record at this state of the game makes sense. I think the committee needs to take half an hour and just give you our concerns or things given what we have. But I would like to know first, when is the report going to be provided to the legislature?
We haven't gotten the final confirmation about the schedule for the next 2 weeks for the committee, but we are given to believe that it could be as soon as next Thursday, the 24th.
Great. So I think that we should start talking. I will tell you, I would hope, and I'm very concerned about the role of private providers and how they're going to be connected. I don't know how. I'm not going to list all of mine right yet. I have 2 pages of concerns that I think I'm going to send, but I am concerned about the role of providers and private providers. I'm also concerned about 3-year-olds, but I'm going to give the room some space to let you folks say some things, and then I'll talk if there's room. Go ahead, Carrie.
So they're listed both on the timeline and as well as on the conceptual framework. I have some concerns with not really knowing where the department's going around the rulemaking for things like definition of developmental delay, child find identification, evaluation, provision of early intervention services, personal qualifications, procedural safeguards. Those are all really, really big things, especially in a parent world and as a stakeholder group. I'm under the understanding that you're making some changes to those things, but we have no idea as to what those changes are going to be. You've just listed that they're considerations that you're making, and I don't know how I can support that without knowing what the considerations are going to be. And those are really, those are pretty impactful to families, all of those things listed there. So those were concerning to me to see them listed without really understanding what the changes will be.
I agree with you, Carrie. Sandy.
Hi, I thought I might just share what I'm hoping to get started with Roberta's approval and guidance so that everyone can kind of hear what maybe one area of Maine is looking at doing. But I know that there's already parts of Maine that are kind of taking this on and figuring it out. And so my hope is to kind of create a position that would be kind of program manager, pilot, project manager that would hopefully be from the CDS world. That would be our to our benefit to have somebody from CDS join with us to help figure out so that we are acknowledging and identifying all of our private providers, all of our community resources, putting out information to them. Part of all of that is really setting up all the protocol and getting out there in the community and letting them know about the change for our region. And so that's going to hospitals, pediatricians, all of our community mental health agencies, DHHS, reaching out to all those people that we know have maybe more of a contact with the 3- and 4-year-olds than the public school does through pre-K. So that's really what, in my vision, that's what that role is going to do, is help educate, help with the change. And then behind the scenes, there's all of the contracts and the fiscal management and the how are we going to schedule IEP meetings and facilitate those? How are we communicating with parents, making sure that they have access to all of the information that they need to have? So really, it's that pilot year next year. I'm hoping that that will happen where we're hopefully getting started before school starts and having that person up and running and getting that figured out and getting that working. And like I've said before, we're gonna make mistakes and we're gonna be figuring things out along the way, but really doing a lot of work on all of those pieces that we know that CDS does right now, in combination, hopefully, with our current CDS folks. So that's kind of like what my thought is. And I know Roberta's been working with other districts, so that I'm just hoping that you guys hear that public schools, I mean, it's my intent to ensure that all of those pieces that CDS does so well are continued, and that we're also then supporting the fiscal part, resource part in our region.
I thank you. I want to say I'm very concerned that this feels like a train that's gone. This isn't. This is a legislative process in which the legislature is supposed to decide whether or not it should go or not, how it should go. These are our young children. There are a tremendous amount of people who are very worried about their roles with providers. As providers, there's people worried about their jobs. There's municipalities who's worried about their taxes. And I guess my biggest concern about this process is that we are forgetting the job that we have, which is to advise the education committee, advise the department, so that they can present a plan, so that the education committee can create a process for the state. What I think would be a terrible, terrible mistake is if things are moving ahead in pieces, so that we're just in a situation which we hear, well, it's already happening, so there's no worry, when I know for a fact that Washington County, for instance, does not have one 4-year-old program, zip, zero, zilch. So I worry a great deal about hearing this in pieces like it's already happening, other than the pilot programs, because there is a lot that has to be talked about before I guess I'm comfortable giving my agreement to these young children. And I'm worried about things like eligibility and what's going to happen with special purpose schools, and how are we going to have inclusion that's not regionalized. There's so much to talk about. There's so many pieces that need to be discussed. And it needs to be discussed in a very public way. And at this point, it hasn't been. Are there other people who want to speak? I do have a list of things that need to be figured out before the train continues down the track, in my opinion.
I think some of the points that you brought up, Nancy, are very valid. And then you look at areas around the state that are very rural, and have access to those public pre-K programs, like you talked about Washington County. I think in Aroostook County, where we have our special purpose programming for our Head Start and non-Head Start children that require those SDI services, we contract with CDS. We've had a very strong relationship and partnership for a very long time with CDS. A lot of the schools around our county connect with us, ACAP, to provide those services to those children that require that intensive support. So I too am very concerned, and they're 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, but a lot of times they enter a public preschool or pre-K program, and they end up coming back to us. So then what? I don't want to jump the gun. I don't want to, be negative about, because on the other side of that, there's a lot of positives as well with this legislation. But I really am concerned about those rural areas in Maine that, they rely on these types of programming.
I agree. One of the things that I looked at the timeline, and I want to hear others is I kept wanting to say, who's going to do it and how is it going to get done? And will there be larger discussions? It seems that everything's being done internally right now, and that is not how this can be done in a comfortable way. We really need to have, like, for instance, discussing child find. I'm hoping that we're going to talk about what that I'm hoping that there'll be a broader, bigger conversation about how do we find kiddos who are 3, where they should go, how we create individual plans and issues that are going on. But it needs to be bigger. Other comments? Rita.
So I guess I was just expecting more details than the conceptual framework document. And I appreciate the timeline and having a visual, and, you know, that's very helpful. But I guess I just, right, you know, I think there's somewhere, you know, there's a comment about just, you know, making revisions to the statute. Well, what are your proposed revisions to the statute? I'd like to see, you know, what those proposals are. And, you know, in terms of the framework, right, just the quasi state agency and the roles and responsibilities and the terms. I mean, I'd like to see what the length of terms, what are your proposal details about all that? I was hoping we'd see that level of detail as opposed to the framework.
Other comments about the timeline or oh, good. There's lots of hands and I'm not looking. Carrie and then Howie. And Rita, are you done or are you in line again? Okay.
I'll keep my hand up. I'm gonna defer to Howie and Priscilla because they haven't had a chance to comment and I've commented twice already.
Thank you very much. Howie.
I just wanted to say I appreciate the timeline because it shows I was confused by all the different pieces, and so it really lays them out. And I assume at some point there will be more details and things, but the format of getting all this information on one page is really helpful. I just had 2 specific questions. I don't know what this where'd it go? Some kind of coordinating council, interagency coordinating council. What is that? Seems very useful.
That's a federal requirement of the Part C program, that you have a state interagency coordinating council. They have one that's functioning. So some of the items that are in there and that are on the conceptual framework are required elements of programming.
And okay, I guess that isn't what I thought it would be. So does it? Is there an agency here that coordinates all these different pieces that are supposed to move in tandem? Like, is that CDS, or is there? It just seems like there's all these different pieces. Just curious.
Howie, could I ask you a follow-up question? Do you think there should be? You know, this is the future. Do you think there should be somebody who's overseeing and doing that, or an advisory council?
Well, yeah, I don't know how the various departments interact on a daily basis, you know, at the state level, and so this just seems to scream out for some really tight coordination, and so I don't know that would look like, but certain pieces, you know, can't move forward if other pieces don't. And so I'm focused on the money, right? So how is a district going to pay for this? And of course, we have the billing side of things, and we have the subsidy side of things, and then I've got to negotiate, you know, new contracts with people. There's an awful lot of things that need to be in place before we kind of launch our program. It seems like it doesn't seem like you can take, as a school district, it'd be hard to take baby steps. Like, it seems like you get everything in place and then you go. And so that's why it just seems like there should be some way to as this moves forward, and maybe there already is, I don't know, for the different agencies to talk to each other and follow this great timeline. And then my other question was just around the timing of what I think is the ED 279. So fiscal considerations right down towards the end there. It looks like there would be decisions made about, you know, if there are changes to the formula, and I don't know if there needs to be. I don't know if you're just adding kids and that's all that needs to happen. But it looks like that is supposed to end next December. And I was curious, I thought that required any changes and things to the ED 279 would require legislative action, and that, you know, just a timing question I had on that one. Didn't know how that's going to work. So
I think one short response, Howie, is certainly, I think, in one of the resolves, and I think it is in the 386 resolve, that there be a project manager or a program manager. So we are looking at having, you know, an FJA or a job description for someone who would sort of have the oversight for making sure that all those working pieces are fitting together. I think the Part C, Interagency Coordinating Council, and then there's a Part B, 3 through 20 Advisory Council so they would be looking at this work going forward, as I think to some degree with the Children's Cabinet that we have reinstated. So there's a couple of entities that certainly are fully aware of what is happening and would be in a position to certainly advise as well as they look at the interconnections of the work.
Thank you, JC. I also wonder
Great.
whether or not there needs to be something else, especially when we're talking about LD 255 and the young kids, about who the lead agency is and how that's going to be kind of structured. And I wonder if the legislature and if the department should be considering something a little bit bigger to that in that coordination. They sent out an MOU that ended in 2016, and there is a lot of moving parts in this thing that we might consider as a body, which is us. We are an advisory body. We might consider creating a recommendation that however it is going to be connected, that it is connected. Because one thing that I heard from you, Howie, that I think is very dangerous is that different school systems might feel like they're out there on their own. And that could be yikes. So Priscilla, I see you.
Hi. Well, I do appreciate the timeline and the amount of work that it went into this. It made me really reflect on what a huge undertaking this is. And there's so many moving parts, and there's so much that really needs that oversight, just to make sure, that everything, that nothing is left out, for specifics, I agreed with Megan. I'm concerned with the private programs, being one myself. Also, you know, we're a contract provider, but just knowing in our little area, there's a huge range of abilities, and we've had a good, strong working relationship with CDS, and we've also gotten kiddos back from public schools that hasn't worked out. and just a really a need to have oversight because that it's so complex that if one thing goes wrong, then or one timeline doesn't interconnect with others, it just speaks to like, whoa. I echoed with Nancy that there's so much there that can be talked about it and gotten into in much more details. I feel like I need to see more details on a lot of it, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Priscilla. I'm really hearing that need of not only oversight of the entire plan, kind of even maybe at a higher level than DOE, but a higher level. But also, what is the system going to look like? Because the stakes are so high, not only for our schools, but our children and our towns. Jamie, and then I'll go to you, Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing some of these private providers talk about how, sometimes those types of programs are, in fact, the least restrictive environment for some children. My child is one of those at this point, and so I recognize the importance of those private programs and keeping those strong partnerships. I think one of my biggest concerns, though, is coordinating all of the other services that go into helping a child, whether that's physical therapy, speech, occupational therapy, transportation. I think these are some of the pain points that we're having right now, that I'm having and my family right now. And so I just think it's really important to hammer out, how are we going to make sure that there's enough access to those kinds of services and that they're smoothly coordinated, and that that school districts have the resources they need to figure that out. And, if there may be some regionalization options for those types of things that can maybe take away some of that crunch, but it's really crucial that that part of it gets cleaned up.
Thank you. I do hear, I hear that loud and clear. That there is a lot going on, and the schools might not even have an idea about how to coordinate. And billing also fits that really strongly when you talk about Section 28 and what EPSDT might mean, and A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I could sing the Mickey Mouse theme song with all this stuff, and parents have to learn that all alone. Carrie.
A little piggyback onto what Jamie was saying. She actually led me in very well. I do, and since day one of me sitting on these committees for these changes way back years ago when we started this process, one of my first concerns was the regionalization of preschool programs. And that is still a major concern with the information that has been brought forward. And I think kids of that age should have the opportunity to have a program in which they are in a least restrictive environment with typically developing peers. And I would hate to see regionalized, specialized preschool programs created where kids are on transportation, especially up in our northern regions where it might be easier to do that, for hours in the day and not having access to typically developing peers. That being said, I want to be clear, regionalization of services is a totally different thing versus a regionalized program. If SAUs need to regionalize their services in order to ensure that children are getting the services that they need, I am completely on board with that and understand the importance of that. So there is a difference, but regionalized programming is something that I don't think would best suit these kids well. And I know least restrictive environments are some of the more difficult things to obtain for these kiddos, especially getting access to typically developing peers. But that's something that goes a long way for these kids in the end game. Thank you.
I see you, Tiffany.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, one of the things about making an assumption that the LRE is going to be in the local public school for 3 and 4-year-olds would mean that there is, a universal pre-K opportunity there, and that there's public pre-K so that there are typical kids, right? So I'm not aware of examples of regional programs that that do what you were describing, but I can picture where, there is a role for typical childcare, and that if the concern, which is a good one, is around access to typically developing peers, then to me, it doesn't necessarily matter the four walls that happens in, if it happens and it's meaningful.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that. The data that was provided to us really showed how universal 4-year-old programs meant something completely different than what I view universal 4-year-old programs, which is, and there was only 36 of them out of the 200 whatever that actually provided 4-year-old programming 5 days a week. It really struck me, and those universal programs did not necessarily mean that they provided CDS special instruction in their 4-year-old program. So it just really strikes me that this is conceptually a huge shift for school districts to even understand what we're asking for, or what is going to be required, and how, although a few excellent programs might be doing it great as pilot programs, they're few in percentage to the rest of the state, like in the 15% range.
Tiffany, I would agree with you.
I'm going to keep it, JC, I'm going to keep it just to the advisory committee now. They just haven't had any time, and they have 30 more minutes, and that's it.
Can I just respond real quick? Tiffany, I would agree with you as far as it doesn't matter where the walls are, as long as there's least restrictive environment and access to typically developing peers, with the exception of a child isn't on transportation for a 3 to 4-year-old isn't on transportation for hours a day. And in some of our northern regions, that could happen with regionalized programming.
I do want to ask though, I am interested in, I just cut JC and I want an answer. When we're looking at eligibility and the process of all this, Megan and JC, maybe you will answer this question, which is who would be making these decisions and what would the process of all of that be? That might solve some of this.
Certainly the regulatory provisions that I was talking about was taking the existing Part C federal regulations out of Chapter 101 and making them their own freestanding Part C rules that follow the federal regulations. That's why the lists are as they are in the timeline, because those are federal requirements, and we were wanting to be clear, because that came up at other advisory meetings about making sure that we were being compliant. So we're just trying to make the distinction that Part C is different in terms of its service delivery model than the Part B 3 to 20. The only other thing I was going to add is there's over 200 public 4-year-old programs. And right now, that through the SAUs, a third of those are partnerships with childcare, Head Start, and others. And Leanne and her team have been allocated, I believe, $10 million in MJRP, which is it's one of the COVID funding streams, which is meant to increase more public 4-year-old programs that would be those LRE integrated settings.
Thank you. Another concern that I've heard a great deal from my council is there's a whole group that the council has talked to me about, or family members of the council council has talked to me about real concern that that things are flexible enough that children are able to get the services they need, and if it's in a special purpose program that exists, if they need more specialized for least restrictive versus in school district. But a lot of people are worried about workforce, and I'm just I'm really concerned about how we're going to be able to keep our workforce as in the middle of all this, especially our CDS personnel that are there now. And I think Dr. Sandy, you were even saying once that there was no guarantee that you had to choose through internal processes how you were going to hire people. So there was no actual guarantee that existing CDS staff would necessarily move in. And I'm concerned about what happens to the existing people and how do we keep them. That's something I'm worried about. Heather.
I might just have a process thought and question. I don't know if you answer it and answer someone else. So, you know, ideally in the bill, there was, you know, these lists of 1 through 8, 9, or 10, you know, things that that were tasked within the DOE to do. And then we are the advisory committee. Are we advising on those, you know, 1 through 10 things?
That's
okay.
Correct. That is exactly what we're supposed to be advising on. And
Okay,
many
so-
of those things were not in the timeline. Right.
Okay, so that, I think that was my question. I'm seeing a lot of things omitted from the timeline. So that's why I didn't know, are they more detailed somewhere else? And maybe that probably was what you were getting to before when you mentioned some of the other, or Carrie, you had mentioned some more of the specific pieces. So is that something, like you said, we only have the end of this meeting now. Is that something we start weighing on now on?
If you want an opportunity to say it out loud on record, I think we have 13 minutes before we talk about what our next or how we do that. I mean, our next steps, we could choose to have another meeting to kind of, I could pull what we're talking about and you guys could email me and we could all look at what are formal recommendations for us to formally write, which might make a lot of sense. And that would also provide us a statement to be able to speak about to the education committee, because there is permission in both bills for us to provide that opinion. And really what I'm trying to look at in this time is how do we get that opinion?
Okay, so I think when I look over that, you know, one of the things that comes to my head is do no harm, right? Like as we go through this, we're shifting a major big thing and we don't want unintended consequences. And again, I'm coming from that lens of those private childcare programs, and you've all kind of heard me talk about this bigger balloon that's happening on with the universal pre-K, and making sure that as we expand universal pre-K, that we're also not closing down child care programs that are serving, you know, infants and toddlers because they can't afford to stay open if they don't have 3 and 4-year-olds. So I think I would really want to see in a more detailed report how we're supporting school districts, because that's a lot to take on to understand the inner workings of also child care programs and community programs that are already happening. And we already see it on the level of, you know, the partnering going on. And while we do have some good partnerships going on, it's easier to in logistics to partner with a Head Start right now, just because they have all those elements in place to meet some of those rule guidelines, than it is a private childcare program who has to work themselves into those rule guidelines. And I'm just afraid that so many partnerships are going to be overlooked because it is going to be more work for the SAU. And I really would love to see part of this system that we are finding out. And I love that, you know, Dr. Flack had brought up hiring someone to work on that, because I really think that's what it's going to take at each SAU, is to have one facilitator within each SAU to help with that, who understands CDS, who understands childcare programs and private partnerships and all those pieces, because there's just so much to that community element of this. And also understanding too, 3 and 4-year-olds are not always in the community, you know, in a childcare program or a setting where, you know, their houses, that their parents move around for work. And what is that going to mean in this system? We don't want to hurt families, you know, especially, you know, at the end of the day, it's probably going to end up hurting families with, you know, less means and access to childcare programs than some others might have, who might have to use a program 45 minutes away versus, you know, within their own town. So there's going to be so much landscape analysis that has to be done within communities and SAU districts that I really think that's going to take a person per SAU to help with that. You know, we know our SAUs are strapped tremendously already with the jobs that they do. So I think those facilitation pieces will be super important.
Megan Barnes.
Sorry, my internet's not doing very well. I keep trying to shut my video off thinking it's going to help, but I think that's really important because Heather, because that, you know, you're right with a Head Start, programming, you can absorb, you can have those qualifications to be able to meet those needs within your program when you provide that childcare piece, that extended day piece. I think, you know, what I wanted to focus on is something that we started this meeting with, and that's that whole family service delivery model. And that is, you know, at its fundamental base, you know, what we want to do. We want to make it easier on the families. We want to make, you know, transportation not a barrier. We want the children to get the services they need, which in turn, you know, helps the whole family. So I think that's a really good point, Heather.
I think it's too. Jillian, I see you.
So Nancy, I know that you mentioned this briefly earlier, but I just want to piggyback on it as a owner of a private practice. I do think that when I look at this timeline, I don't see anything that really takes into consideration us outside providers that have contracted with CDS for a great length of time. And I think it's going to be so super important that there's that communication network so that we also know what's going on with the changes and what are we going to expect. And that when I see the training and professional development, what does that mean? Is that for just people in the SAUs? Is that for your contracted providers? Who's going to get this training? Because I think right now, even with CDS, a lot of times when there's a change that happens, contractor providers don't necessarily know it right away, and it can be really frustrating. And I think if we can proactively say that could be something we could fix by going down this model, is keeping those contractor providers really knowledgeable about the whole process. I think that's really important.
You know, one thing that I'm really hearing over and over again, it does go back to a little bit to the who and how of all this, these timelines, who's going to be making these decisions. JC, you talked a little bit about essentially the APA process, the process of rulemaking, determining that stuff. I think there has to be an entire process before we even get to those rulemaking, a task force to talk about what should be in there, what are the key pieces, especially listening to this group right now talking about private providers, early childhood, Head Start, and parents and families, and school districts. I'm really concerned about without knowing who is going to be talking about what the definition of developmental delay is and how are we going to make those decisions. I think it's very important that we don't just I think that the department should really think of a formalized process before the APA and say it to the education committee that this is how we're going to make sure that we're getting all these different perspectives outside of just, I'm afraid of ivory tower syndrome, that kind of what you're seeing only from that one place. Transportation's another that we haven't even begun talking about, and number of things. Let's just take 6 more minutes and then we'll talk about next steps. Is there more to say? You know, there's a lot in here. Go ahead, Rita. You're still.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say that, you know, we've all talked many, many times about how complicated this all is, and it is, and that is the reason why we've spent years and years, and you know, things aren't as good for young kids who need these services as they should be. But I would just encourage all of us to think about all the things that have been accomplished by government during the pandemic when we had an emergency and we just, everyone came together and got things done. And I think we have to start thinking about fixing this process in that same way and not get bogged down in all of these many details and all of our many concerns that we just don't move. So I hope we can keep this process moving forward and that we can accomplish things during this legislative session.
Yeah, me too. I see nods. So is there, when we look at this process, is there, what is our next steps? We as a group should be providing recommendations. And I don't feel like we have a group set of decisions right yet. Do you? I feel like we've had a lot of opportunity for individual feedback, but less for an advisory committee's body to be able to provide a group. Do we want to have another meeting quickly, which of course as the advisory committee we absolutely can do, to create a document to give to the education committee? I mean the Department of Education and the education committee. What is our next steps? What do you think is a good idea for that? Or do you think our job is done?
Carrie has her hand up.
Okay, Carrie.
Thank you, Carol. It's and Nancy, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that the understanding of the Educational Cultural Affairs Committee is that whatever is reported out by the Maine Department of Education, whenever that happens, is they're going to understand it as it being supported by the department and our stakeholder group as well. Is that correct?
I've heard from from legislators that they want that. Do we feel like we can support whatever they give in?
I think that's where our conversation needs to be next, is how we as a stakeholder group are going to approach that with the information we have, I guess.
I think that's important, especially because the legislation actually says something like, what was our process, what was our role, and how do we feel about it? It's pretty clear in there. And we also need to know, I'm unclear, is the advisory committee done? When are we done? Are we done at the report? Or is there a need for our function? And do we think there's a need for our continued function? And I would say we probably do have a need. I would recommend that one of our recommendations is that we do continue. But we need to talk about that. Rita, I saw your mute go off. I see Tiffany's mute off. Tiffany, go.
I mean, for what it's worth, I gotta say, I feel like I disagree, Nancy. I feel like our work is done, and that if a report is going to be submitted as early as Thursday, and we don't know the details of that. I don't think we're being asked for anything specific right now. And maybe that's important if there's something specific that we're being asked to do, consider, decide. But I mean, I'm not feeling that there are significant tasks that we're being asked to help with right now necessarily. I don't know.
How do others feel?
But I mean, there's probably an answer whether or not the advisory committee is needed at this point, right? I mean, there's probably an answer.
Can I speak for just a second? I certainly I don't want to step on time, and I want to make sure people but it's not that we're not asking. We certainly want to you know, to make sure that we're hearing your feedback, and would say, like, we will be continuing to work on this and would love for people to continue to share. I don't know if you've written down these. I've been taking, I'm on page 4 or 5 right now of copious notes. But if you have pieces that you want to share, please email them to us. Please, you know, let us know, because we are asking for you to continue to let us know so that we can incorporate the feedback. We can say, oh, okay, that makes sense. We didn't include that piece in the timeline. We can articulate that more clearly. But we really are not intending to just kind of sit here today right now and close our ears. So we are asking for you to continue to share feedback. I'd love to say up through the end of the day on Friday, the 18th, I know it's just this Friday, just so that we have time to be able to write and prepare adequately. But certainly are not saying that we're shutting things down, you know, at 2:30 today.
All right, this is important.
Jamie has her hand up, Nancy.
Oh, thank you very much. I didn't see that. Thank you. Go,
This could be
Jamie.
just very quick, you know, in terms of if we still have work to do. I think what I've seen so far is still so amorphous, and I think that as things take greater shape, I would certainly welcome the opportunity to be consulted in an ongoing fashion, and I wonder if that could be the way something like that looks, that as kind of things take shape, we're sort of called to look at it periodically.
Yeah, and I see that the advisory committee may also report to the Joint Standing Committee on Education and Cultural Affairs on our role, what our role was in the department's development of the process, timeline, and implementation plan. What what would you want to report about our role, and what you would want to be able to speak out about that?
So there will be a report, but I know we had this discussion before and I just want to make sure, but we won't see that report of this process until it's given to the Ed committee.
That's what it sounds like. Yeah.
Okay.
So we
So I
need to
think
figure
for
out
me,
from us.
it's hard to know if my recommendations were heard if I don't know they're in there. I guess that would be my piece. Yeah, I could see some of it in the timeline, but I don't know in the more detailed process if.
Okay. I'm here. Go ahead, Rita.
Yeah, I think I said it earlier, just that I'm really feeling a need for more details, being able to see more of the details and to react to them. And I am happy to do that whenever that document's available.
So why don't I write up a summary, and I'll share it with Tiffany, and she can agree or not and send it out to y'all, and have that summary written up of about kind of where we've done what we've talked about, what the process of us was. Does that sound okay? I'm seeing nods. That gets us somewhere else. Okay, that's so you, Megan Walter, you were saying that you're going to have this done by Friday. Is that correct? The report's going to be written up?
No, I was saying if you have feedback to give, if we could have our timeline stop on Friday so that we'll be working through the weekend on it. So no, it won't be done by Friday. I was just saying that if you have more feedback to give, please get it to us by Friday so that we can get it in. I'd love it earlier, you know.
I see you, Carrie.
Is there any chance that the stakeholder group sees the report prior to you guys presenting it?
That's a good question. I would like to say that if we were to do that, I think that, first of all, I'm going to kind of defer a little bit and make sure I'm not getting us in any trouble. I think that's okay. I'm still new enough in my position where I'm not sure of all the ins and outs of sharing a report that's intended for the committee before the committee sees it. So my instinct would say that we could create a draft of sorts to say, this is how we're responding to your feedback, and these are the pieces that we're adding. And I also want to just make sure that like we build in adequate amount of time to have some turnaround. So if we were to say that, then I'd say, then please, oh please, get feedback to us Wednesday or Thursday, so that then we can write sooner, so that we can get it to you sooner, so that we could have some kind of a feedback loop before, if we do end up needing to present to the committee on Thursday, which is, like I said before, not a certainty.
Thanks. I don't know how individually how people feel about, but I have a hard time with members of the committee thinking that the stakeholder group would be approving everything that was in the report without us knowing what was in the report. And while I appreciate what was provided to us last week and I had the ability to review, there's still a lot of questions for me. And to have, I mean, it's not my name personally attached, but I'm not confident with what you've provided that I would be in 100%, not that it's going to be 100% agreement, but that I would be able to support the report as a stakeholder member without really, like, it's kind of like putting our names on something without us knowing, and I don't sign documents without reading them. It's like going to the car dealership and signing the contract before I read all the small print. And so that's my hesitancy. I don't know you've provided me with sort of what's the word I'm looking for? The timeline is much more detailed, but the conceptual framework is more like, it's like the chapters that are going to be in the report. I have no idea what's within those chapters, and it's hard for me to support that without really having understanding as to what's in those chapters. I guess that's my hesitation right now.
Right. Did you just say that you were going to send us a draft report? When might you get that? You did not say that.
No,
Okay.
I was saying I'm saying these words right now and I'm thinking that's okay, but I'd like to check that for sure. So I also, it's not just me writing this. And so it's a team effort. And so trying to get this done for all intents and purposes 4 or 5 days sooner, we just have to know kind of what's on our team's plate and figure out all those pieces.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, JC.
I think from my point of view, I think we're hoping, because we've been working with finance and others and really wanted to get the feedback, and I've been taking copious notes too, that part of what our hope was that, and why we'd given the protocol for sort of the feedback for the timeline, is the timeline sets out what we see as where we need to go with all 3 of those resolves, and with the big buckets within each one of them, where there's staffing examination, there's budget examination, there's structural examination. The conceptual framework is lifted from both the feedback that we were given after Sarah did her overview in terms of structures that need to be in place, particularly for the state IU. So that was lifted literally from all of those notes as what we thought would be a framework for a statute. I think we anticipated that perhaps we might get feedback on both that as a framework and the timeline as the sort of work plan that's driving the work going forward under the direction of a project manager that would be the project manager for all 3 of those sets of work from the resolve. And certainly we will be embedding the various items that you've given us today into that timeline.
Did anybody have any comments about the conceptual framework? Yeah, Rita.
Well, so I just had a question about any statutory recommendations. Do you plan to submit a department bill?
Not at this time.
I did not expect that you were going to be doing that in the next week. But do you plan to do that this session, or do you plan on having the education committee develop that?
I think if you look on the timeline, there's reflection of looking at a concept which we had anticipated perhaps sharing with them after we had shared it with you as the framework that would need to be refined for Part C. And once they agree that that's the framework, then we can start working with Sarah Forster to develop that.
I saw that. I saw the conceptual framework and I did read it, but it felt like an outline. It felt like an outline. It didn't have the as much concepts for me to understand overall. So it has good, solid outline structure, similar to what I would see in kind of a table of contents. But I'm not sure it's hard for me to get the of it all in there. I know we have 3 more minutes, Rita. Do you have something else? Okay. So I guess what I'll do is I'll send something to Tiffany, see if we can come to an agreement of a summary of stuff. I'll probably watch things again and give general, then just send it to you folks, and have you guys give an opinion about what I write, and then we can send it on, say, this is going to be very, very fast, say Thursday. So there we go. Is that okay with you? So I'll send it out by Wednesday. Could you get it back to me by Thursday? It's just there's so little time in life. All right. Great. I really want to thank you guys. I want to thank you for your work. I want to thank you for your commitment. I want to thank the department. This has been very, very difficult and complicated and challenging even how to structure these meetings. So I want to thank you very much. And I'll be in touch very soon. And Tiffany, I want to thank you a lot. So thank you very much. Bye.